Boldwood presents Murder in Covent Garden. Written by Anita Davison and read by Una Beeson. Chapter 1. Covent Garden, London, July 1917. Hannah paused on the front steps of the Endell Street Military Hospital, allowing her eyes to adjust to the glare of the sun reflecting off the austere granite buildings of the former workhouse. Pushing loaded book trolleys around 4 floors of wards all morning in the unrelenting heat had drained her. So she took a few moments' respite before beginning the short walk back to the bookshop she ran with her Aunt Violet. The hospital cared for over 500 wounded soldiers brought in from the battlefields of Belgium and France, many of whom originated from countries as far away as Canada and Australia. The time she spent with the patients made up for her fatigue, as she found it impossible to complain when faced with such stoic, optimistic men, who always had a joke and a kind word for her. Descending the steps into the walled courtyard where hot cobbles burned through the soles of her shoes, she negotiated a path through tradesmen's vans, ambulances, porters and scurrying nurses, the air laden with the combined odours of manure, cooked food and petrol fumes. At the massive gate, the porter acknowledged her with a nod, just as the main hospital door shut behind her with a resounding bang, accompanied by a high-pitched shout. "Miss Merrill! Miss Merrill!" Hannah turned to where a girl in the grey-green tunic of a voluntary aid detachment nurse took the 3 front steps down in one leap, skillfully avoided a pair of nurses carrying a patient on a stretcher, and ran to join her. "If you're on your way back to your bookshop, may I walk with you? Archie's taking me to tea at Lyon's Corner House for my birthday." "Then let me wish you a happy birthday, Dinah." Hannah realised this explained why Archie, her assistant manager, had requested time off that afternoon. "You're lucky to have such a thoughtful brother." "He is that, miss." Dinah's infectious smile faded. "He invited Ned as well, hoping to cheer him up a bit, but he won't step outside the house these days." "How is Ned?" Hannah recalled with sadness how Archie and Dinah's older brother had arrived home from Arras 3 months before, minus his right foot. "He's a bit down, if I'm honest, miss. He won't even try looking for a job. He says no one wants cripples." "That's very sad. But I'm sure there's something Ned could do. Office work, perhaps?" "Ned was never one for schooling, miss. You know, figures and whatnot. Leastways, Archie doesn't talk about joining the army anymore. Don't think it appeals to him much now. Though, now he's 18, the conscription will probably get him in the end." Her deep sigh showed the inevitability the family faced. Hannah's sympathy rose for young Ned, who was not yet 21, but who would carry the scars of war for the rest of his life, not to mention the memories. An obsequious porter nodded them through the main gate onto Endell Street, that simmered in the midsummer heat, the window boxes on the sills at the Cross Keys public house opposite wilting in the heat. "You have 2 more brothers serving, don't you, Dinah? How are they getting on?" "3 of them, miss. 2 older and 1 younger. Mum says as long as the letters keep coming, we mustn't fret." "It must be so hard for your mother." Hannah matched her pace to Dinah's quick steps as they turned the corner into busy Longacre, where wheels and hooves kicked up dust that thickened the already humid air. It was only a short walk to the bookshop Hannah and her Aunt Violet owned, but by the time they reached the next street, her short bob beneath her light straw hat clung wetly to the back of her neck. "She gets upset sometimes, and Ned's moods don't help," Dinah sighed. "But we try our best to keep her spirits up." On the corner of Bow Street, they paused at the curb to allow an omnibus clatter past in a cloud of dust, to reveal a man in his 60s on the other side of the road arguing fiercely with a taller man, in a tan overcoat and matching fedora set at a jaunty angle. The older man wore a flared black jacket that fell below his knees in a style popular in the last days of the previous century, worn open to reveal a waistcoat in a startling peacock blue, with a cream cravat resting between high white collar points. A black stovepipe hat concealed most of his dark hair. His features red and distorted in the fierce altercation with the younger man, their hurled words accompanied by clenched fists and pointed fingers. Hannah frowned, intrigued at the intensity of the exchange, though mostly their words were inaudible over the noise of passing wheels, motor cars and tradesmen's horse carts that filled the street. The older man's face was an angry red, his trim bearded chin jutting into his companion's face. Pedestrians circled round them, most ignoring them, though some looked back with a mixture of bemusement and disgust. "Do you know them, miss?" Dinah asked as the argument drew the attention of other passers-by, some even pausing to watch before moving on. "The older gentleman is Mr. Cornelis," Hannah replied. "He owns a jeweller's shop in Floral Street, but I don't know the other." "I always thought Mr. Cornelis was the quiet, unassuming sort, but he seems furious with the younger man." "Well, he don't look very unassuming now, does he?" Dinah giggled. "You should come down our road on a Saturday night, miss. Then you'll see a fight. They have real bloodletting down there." "I'll take your word for that, Dinah." "The younger chap ain't saying much," Dinah observed. "The old bloke is doing all the talking." "Nor does he seem at all bothered. He's actually smiling now." "If you can call that sneer a smile." Dinah flinched, her hold on Hannah's arm tightening. "Oh, did you see that? The old bloke just hit him with his cane." "I did, yes. Although it couldn't have been very hard. He barely reacted." The younger man shrugged, bored with the exchange. He tossed the remains of his cigarette into the gutter and aimed a dismissive wave at the jeweller before striding away down Longacre. "Miss?" Hannah felt a sharp tug on her sleeve. "I don't mean to hurry you, but Archie's expecting me at past, and it's almost that now." "Yes, of course, I'm sorry, Dinah." Hannah dragged her thoughts back to negotiating the traffic, and once on the other side, turned to keep the older man in view. He halted on the pavement, his mouth working in fury as he stared after the younger one, before pulling back his shoulders and setting off after him, his cane striking the pavement with hard, rhythmic taps. Chapter 2. The bookshop door stood open when Hannah and Dinah arrived. The brass ceiling-mounted fan whirred to move the still air. Hannah immediately noticed their new assistant teetering on a ladder. The shop appeared empty. Penny half turned to see who had come in, making the ladder wobble slightly, and Hannah's breath hitched until it steadied again. A few shorter side strands broke free from Penny's wavy brown hair, gathered into a plait at her neck, framing her oval face and falling down her back. "Mr. Root!" she called, giving Hannah an airy wave before returning her attention to her task. "Miss Merrill is here with your sister." A sweet-natured girl of 15, their new assistant possessed a compact frame, combined with the awkwardness of a young deer. Her sunny personality made up for the fact she often knocked things over, a clumsiness Hannah put down to nerves, and something she hoped she would grow out of. In the 4 months of working at the bookshop, she had gained an impressive knowledge of the stock, though she had arrived with less familiarity with literature. Her secret crush on Archie, 3 years her senior, added to her eagerness to please, while he remained oblivious to her devotion. During Hannah's first days at the bookshop, almost 2 years earlier, the sound of Archie's name brought him running, his gawky limbs flying and with an eager-to-please expression on his face. Now he climbed the steps up from the lower floor with a swagger, his hair combed and slicked back, his wrinkle-free waistcoat buttoned and his shoes highly polished. He had grown a couple of inches in the last few months, with biceps bulging noticeably beneath his shirt sleeves. Dinah's mention of the imminent arrival of his conscription papers returned, but all Hannah dared hope for was an end to the war before that happened. Aunt Violet had recently promoted him to the position of assistant manager, and he had taken up residence in the apartment over the shop, a move which suited everyone, especially Archie, who had previously lived with his mother in her tiny villa on the edge of Holborn, where he shared an attic bedroom with 2 younger brothers and the family dog. Hannah suspected he missed the dog, and almost suggested that he get one of his own, but Bartleby, their bookshop cat, thwarted that idea. "There you are, Dinah, and perfect timing." Acknowledging Hannah with a nod, Archie rolled down his sleeves, fastening them at his wrists. "I thought you might have forgotten our outing." He collected his jacket from a hook on the wall and shrugged it on. Despite the discomfort of wearing formal clothing in the heat, Archie liked to do things correctly, even for tea with his sister at Lyon's Corner House on the Strand. "As if I could. I've been looking forward to this all day, so don't let's dawdle." Dinah looped her arm through his and tugged him towards the door. "What's the hurry?" "We've plenty of time." Archie lightly resisted her. "Lyons is open at all hours." "I know, but they might run out of ice cream before we get there. You know they only make half what they used to, what with the cream and sugar shortages." "I wish I was coming with you." Hannah took her seat behind her desk on the small platform, which gave her a clear view of the shop. "Why don't you join us, Miss Merrill? You'd be very welcome," Dinah offered, though the look of alarm on Archie's face said otherwise. "That's kind, Dinah, but you deserve a treat on your birthday, so enjoy it. And we'll see you tomorrow, Archie." Grinning with gleeful anticipation, Dinah steered him outside, and in seconds they were gone. "I wouldn't say no to an ice cream right now. I'm fit to melt myself," Penny sighed, her attempt to wangle an invitation ignored. Hannah felt sorry for her as her face gleamed with sweat, her cotton dress sporting shadows beneath her arms. It was stifling in the hospital today. Hannah's straw boater joined her jacket on the row of hooks. And despite the windows being open, there wasn't a breath of wind. She gave the shop a vague look as she returned to her desk. "Where's my Aunt Violet?" "She's in her office," Penny replied, her pixie features contorted into a conspiratorial smile. "With a gentleman." The office was a somewhat lofty name for the room in a corner of the half-basement where Hannah or her aunt would retreat for some privacy. "Do we know him?" Had the visitor been Detective Inspector Farrell, a regular caller and her aunt's beau, Penny would have told her. For her aunt to take an unknown gentleman into their private domain was worthy of curiosity. No idea. And she didn't introduce me neither. Penny hugged a book to her midriff. She glanced past Hannah's shoulder and her eyes widened. Look out! Here they are now! Aunt Violet's musical laugh reached them as she mounted the stairs in the company of a man who looked to be in his early 50s, wearing a wrinkle-free suit of the finest navy blue wool, a gold silk cravat sitting between his white collar points. Tall and with well-chiselled symmetrical features, he wore his thick dark hair perfectly styled, with a light layer of pomade brushed back from a low forehead, emphasising 2 silver wings at his temples. His eyes were a warm brown that glinted with pleasure as he looked at Aunt Violet, as if they were sharing a private joke. As they reached the top of the stairs, her aunt stopped in her tracks when she saw Hannah. I thought you would be out for the afternoon. Her aunt's voice conveyed a hint of annoyance. Well, now I'm back. Hannah summoned a welcoming smile and extended her hand to her aunt's guest, who looked cool and unruffled despite the scorching afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Hannah Merrill, Miss Edward's niece. I was about to introduce you, you know. Aunt Violet pursed her lips in mock affront. This is a friend of mine, Mr. Emilio Alfara. Emilio, my niece, Hannah Merrill. Delighted to meet you. His voice was as rich and engaging as his immaculate appearance. His perfect English tinged with a slight accent as he bowed over Hannah's hand. He stood close enough for her to inhale clean linen and sandalwood tinged with rosewater. Violet has told me a great deal about you. Has she? Hannah raised one eyebrow in her aunt's direction. Giving away my secrets? Aunt Violet pulled a face but stayed silent. She tells me you have earned a reputation as an amateur detective. His mouth twitched as he gauged the dynamics between them. I almost didn't recognize the place. No longer a dusty, cramped bolt hole for hen-pecked husbands and housemaids looking for an undisturbed half-hour. Now it's an emporium of art, knowledge, and education. I see you're familiar with the Covent Garden bookshop, Mr. Alfara. Hannah shot another questioning look at her aunt, who had found something interesting on her lapel and studiously frowned at it. I do indeed, although it was not called that in my day. His gaze roved the rows of bookshelves, lingering on the light fixtures and the artwork on the walls before coming back to her. I'm delighted to see Violet has benefited from it more than I would have done. I hope we both have, Hannah replied, her frustration growing. His response raised more questions than it answered, since Aunt Violet had never explained how she came to be the proprietor of a bookshop, and it now appeared she intended to keep it that way. Are you in London for long? Despite her aunt's growing impatience, evident by the way she was fiddling with a button on her sleeve, Hannah persisted. I assume you don't live in the city? I do not. But I have business to conduct here in London, which requires completion before I return to my estate in Mallorca. And now, if you'll excuse me. He sketched a bow to each of them that would have shamed a courtier. I have an appointment I dare not be late for, although this has been a delightful interlude, and Violet. He lifted her hand and kissed her bare knuckles. I am so looking forward to our dinner tomorrow evening. Yes, so am I. Her aunt's response was perfunctory, but her smile held something more. Miss Merrill? He bowed again. I hope there will be an opportunity for us to meet again before I leave. That would be... Hannah broke off as Aunt Violet slid her arm through his and guided him firmly away. Penny intercepted them, offering the visitor his hat, which he took with courtly gratitude, leaving the girl blushing. But then Penny spent half her life in a state of nervous embarrassment. Aunt Violet and her guests exchanged a few words out on the pavement. Then, with a final bow, he strode across the road to a waiting Rolls-Royce. The driver spotted him at the last second and scrambled from his seat in a panic and threw open the rear door. He's very handsome, Hannah observed when her aunt re-entered the bookshop and joined her at the window. Have you known him long? We have known each other for a while. How long a while? Hannah was unwilling to let the subject of the handsome stranger drop. 6 or 7 years. Her aunt waved an airy hand. I cannot remember exactly. Why haven't you mentioned him to me before? Hannah asked, doubting he was a mere acquaintance. And you're having dinner with him tomorrow night? From the corner of her eye, she saw Penny had returned to her ladder, but remained suspended there listening. I'm not mentioning him now, darling. You're the one quizzing me. Regardless, he has been abroad for years, so there was no reason to discuss him with you. And what's so unusual about dining with a friend? Her aunt shrugged as they watched the immaculate motor car glide away. Are you really going to dinner with him? Hannah asked, goaded into sharpness. Goodness, Hannah, I'm almost middle-aged. I can spend my time with whoever I choose. I wasn't implying anything else, but it seems unfair to Aidan. When her aunt did not react, she persisted. He must be wealthy, and in the way of someone who is born to it. I don't know many people who own chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royces. Or maybe he hired it? Enough! Aunt Violet clapped her hands and turned from the window. It's bad form to be so intrusive. Give the man his privacy. Now, change the subject and tell me how your luncheon with my dear sister Madeline went. I trust you gave her my love. More like you're guarding your own privacy. Hannah gave her a knowing look, but was ignored. And I haven't set eyes on my mother. I've been at the hospital library most of the day. What made you think that? Oh. Her aunt straightened, genuinely puzzled. She told me she would be in town this week, so I assumed she had persuaded you to look at wedding gowns. Sorry, I must have misunderstood. It's next week, and please don't mention wedding gowns. It's all Mamma talks about these days. Hannah sighed. She sends me every edition of Vogue and Le Costume Royal, with all the outfits she approves of clearly marked. I keep telling her the wedding isn't until next year at the earliest, but she won't listen. The fashion plates are lovely, but not my style. Too much? Aunt Violet's smile was more a smirk. Perhaps not for St. Margaret's Westminster, with royalty on the guest list. But for Darius and me, that's far too fussy and extravagant. Especially whilst the war is still going on. It feels disrespectful. Have you decided exactly what you do want? Aunt Violet turned her attention to a pile of bills and invoices. A small, intimate ceremony at St. Nicholas Church with close family and friends present, after which I'd like to place my bridal bouquet on Lily Ann's grave. It's not a grave, it's a mausoleum. Aunt Violet looked up, frowning. Or is it a catacomb? She shrugged and went back to the paperwork. If it were me, I'd be panic-stricken at the thought of being accidentally locked inside. Trust you to think of that. And I didn't intend to go inside, certainly not wearing a wedding dress anyway. It's a lovely gesture, darling, and I was only teasing. You must know my sense of humour by now. Her expression sharpened. You still miss her, don't you? Hannah nodded. I cannot believe Lily-Anne has been gone almost 2 years. She leaned against her aunt's desk, creating a brief draft that sent some of the pages fluttering to the floor. When I leave the house some days, I still expect her to come sauntering towards me on the river road wearing a frilly white dress and holding one of her ridiculous parasols. Her gaze strayed to the wing-back chair in the corner, as an unbidden image of the last time she had seen her best friend Lily-Anne Soames jumped into her head. A slender girl in an apricot organza gown, seated upright beneath a frothy, wide-brimmed hat that hid part of her face. A charming picture, if not for the paper knife thrust between her ribs. Hannah's eyes stung and she blinked away sudden tears, inhaling a slow breath to compose herself. We promised to be at each other's weddings, and although I felt totally lost at the spectacular event her mother arranged, as I hardly knew anyone, I still wish she could see me at mine. I remember it well. The less charitable guests accused her of vying with Consuelo Vanderbilt with her 12 bridesmaids, and the church was so stacked full of flowers it was difficult to breathe. But then Lily-Anne took after her mother, with her inflated view of her social importance. Hannah chose not to remind her aunt that she was one of those bridesmaids. Even now she could not bear to part with the dress, though doubted she would ever wear it again. I'd rather hear more about Mr. Emilio Alfara, she said, refusing to be distracted by talk of weddings. There's not much to tell. Aunt Violet sifted through the papers scattered across the desk. Spanish mother, English father, educated at Eton, and left the country some years ago to take up his family's vineyards in the Balearic Islands. I haven't seen him since. I doubt he's turned up today out of the blue, purely to reminisce over days gone by with someone he barely knows. Hannah loaded her voice with scepticism. What's odd about that? And I distinctly heard him tell you he has business here, although I have no idea what. Oh, and his wife died recently, so he came to sort out her affairs. She added this snippet, as if she had only at that moment thought about it, but it seemed contrived. Ah, so he's a widower? Hannah asked, hoping to elicit more, but was to be disappointed. Obviously. She spotted Penny striding across the shop and called out, Penny, dear, have the copies of Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man arrived yet? My ladies at the club requested I hold back some copies for them. Aunt Violet referred to the inactive Women's Social and Political Union as her club, so as not to alarm her more conservative customers, despite the prominent display stand that held copies of Votes for Women near the cash register. Yes, Miss Edwards? Penny's head and shoulders appeared from behind a bookshelf. They're in the reserved box. I read some of it the other night, but I found him rather maudlin. I prefer adventure stories myself. You read it before it even made it to the shelves? Aunt Violet spoke with a slight edge to her voice, but no real annoyance. I was careful. I didn't turn any corners down or anything, and I'll put it back when I've finished. Oh, well, I doubt anyone will notice. Aunt Violet tutted as she ushered Penny towards the storeroom, the subject of the mysterious stranger firmly closed. Hannah's earlier confrontation between Mr. Cornelis and the strange man would also have to wait until supper at the house they shared in Chiswick Mall. As soon as they stepped into the relative cool of the neat Georgian house by the River Thames, however, her aunt disappeared upstairs to change, appearing again later to make a brief stop in the sitting room to announce she had a meeting of her Women's League to attend and would be out for the rest of the evening. Convinced she was being avoided, Hannah settled down to a solitary supper, but with the consolation of a letter from her fiancé, Darius, informing her he would be back in London the following day and hoped to call on her. With his fluent German and an uncanny knack for solving complicated puzzles, Darius Clifford had joined the civilian arm of the Secret Intelligence Bureau in late 1915. He claimed to spend most of his working life poring over codes and ciphers in a room with a group of similar SWATs. His work was deeply secret, and he had recently been awarded a commission in the Navy and worked in what was known as Military Intelligence 5 Division. Hannah's consolation for promising not to ask intrusive questions was that Darius was doing important work for the war effort. Sometimes she experienced sleepless nights worrying about his safety on these clandestine trips he took, mostly at short notice. He always assured her he was never in danger, but this had been soundly scotched the previous Easter when he had taken her on what she had thought was an impromptu trip to Lowestoft with her Aunt Violet and Inspector Farrell. And while there, a German fleet had attacked the town. They had cowered in a cliff-top house, listening to the guns bombarding the seafront, only to survive unscathed and be confronted by a murderess. The latter was nothing to do with Darius, but it was a sobering experience, during which her Aunt Violet had been injured. Chapter 3. Hannah climbed from the scarlet leather bucket seat of her aunt's Sunbeam Roadster outside their bookshop on Catherine Street early the following morning. She placed a hand on her hat, her head tilted to admire the gleaming green and gold facade with its multi-pane double bay windows with their random scattering of bottlenose glass. Staring at it won't stop the Germans taking potshots at it again. Aunt Violet beamed to show she teased and slammed the driver's door shut. I love looking at it. Hannah shrugged, embarrassed at being caught. And don't talk like that, you'll jinx it. Her nerves always tightened as she sighted the bookshop for the first time each morning, hoping it would still be intact. 2 years prior, a German bomb had almost completely destroyed the shop, and after extensive and costly rebuilding, they'd recreated the Georgian frontage. And talking of staring, Mr. Brindley is at his window again. She cocked her chin to their neighbour, who observed them from the shop next door. Oh, people should be used to motor cars by now, since they've been around for at least 15 years. Aunt Violet gave the watcher a flamboyant curtsy that sent the portly shopkeeper scurrying backwards. Aunt Violet's pale green summer-weight jacket swung as she crossed the pavement. Flared from the waist to mid-thigh over a matching skirt, her aunt's slender figure and youthful face attracted admiring stares from male passers-by. Her aunt rarely found the attention flattering, either ignoring or being accustomed to it. At the bookshop door, Hannah looked along the road, to where Detective Inspector Aidan Farrell strode towards them from the direction of the Strand, his hat pulled low and his light raincoat flapping with each firm step. "What's he doing here so early?" Her aunt's tiny frown changed into a soft smile as he drew closer. "He mentioned nothing to me." "I've no idea, Aunt Violet, but you're blushing." "I certainly am not," her aunt snapped. "We've just driven 6 miles under a blistering sun. I can feel the wrinkles multiplying as I stand here." "Morning, Violet. Hannah." The inspector greeted them, raising his hat an inch before lowering it again. "I know it's early, and I'm sorry to say, this isn't a social call." "Not Darius?" Hannah's smile faded, and her thoughts went into freefall. "Have you had bad news?" Her fiancé was on a clandestine mission for the Military Intelligence 5 Division. Despite his insistence that he did most of his secret work in an office in Whitehall, every knock on the door gave Hannah's heart an unpleasant jolt until she knew he was safe. "I apologise for alarming you, Hannah. However, I'm not here about Mr. Clifford." "Too late." Hannah exhaled a relieved breath, a hand pressed to her bodice to calm her racing heart. "How else are we supposed to view a policeman calling at this hour of the morning?" She paused, then indicated the bookshop. "Won't you come inside?" No, I won't if you don't mind." He examined the empty street in both directions. "I'm expecting a colleague to join me, so I'd better stay visible, or I'll miss him. Or should I say, he'll miss me." "Well, we cannot stand here discussing whatever it is on the street. I'll ask Archie to keep a lookout for him." Aunt Violet slipped her arm through his and drew him up the front step into the bookshop and called, "Archie, we have a visitor." Archie appeared, almost instantly from the rear storeroom, wiped his hands on a cloth, and slung it over one forearm like a waiter. "Inspector Farrell, we haven't seen you for a while." "Mr. Root?" The policeman responded with a slight inclination of his head. "I see you're conscientiously prompt. It must be almost an hour before opening time." "Archie lives on the premises now, Inspector." "Aidan?" Hannah faltered, confused about how to address him while on an official call. The unmistakable sound of a book falling over brought her gaze to where Penny peered out from behind a bookshelf. "You're here early." Hannah gestured her forward. "Yes, miss. I offered to help Archie unpack a new consignment before we opened." She eyed the policeman warily. "Inspector, I don't believe you met our new assistant, Penelope Wells. This is Inspector Farrell from Scotland Yard." "I've heard a lot about you, sir." Penny's brown eyes rounded as she took his outstretched hand and returned his firm shake. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Wells." Inspector Farrell inclined his head politely. "Oh, sir, it's Penny, please. No one calls me Miss Wells." She blushed and dipped into a curtsy, then thought better of it and straightened again. "Won't you take a seat?" Dismissing Penny with a reassuring smile, Hannah indicated one of the 3 chairs around a central desk that contained various small ledgers, papers, and piles of books. "I won't, thank you." He inclined his head. "I prefer to stay in sight of the window. I told him where I would be, but you know these young chaps. They rarely listen." Archie shot him a hurt look, to which the inspector chuckled, adding, "I didn't mean you, Mr. Root." "Would you keep an eye out for the inspector's colleague, Archie?" Hannah flicked the latch on the shop door in case a stray customer thought they were open. "Certainly, Miss Merrill." With a curt nod at her and a frown at the inspector, Archie took his place at a smaller desk near the door with a clear view of the street. Penny moved over to stand close by. "I shall be quick so as not to waste your time, ladies." Inspector Farrell placed his bowler hat on the corner of the larger desk where Aunt Violet sat. "There was an incident a couple of streets away, and I'm canvassing the area to see if anyone saw anything unusual yesterday evening." "You're well aware we close at 6. Aunt Violet propped her elbows on the desk and leaned her chin in her hands and held his gaze. "Which makes it unlikely, but we'd still like to hear it." A distinct blush crept into the inspector's high cheekbones, a characteristic he could not prevent whenever in Violet's company. Most men found Hannah's aunt distracting with her deep, slow voice and disarming smile. Aidan's reaction still surprised her. "A burglary occurred practically around the corner from here." He moved his gaze from Violet's face with difficulty. "I cannot reveal too many details." "Spoil sport," Aunt Violet pouted. "We've helped locate murderers and spies in our brief history. In fact, I almost lost an arm in our last encounter, so surely you trust us by now." "Aunt Violet, someone stabbed you," Hannah scoffed. "Which must have been excruciatingly painful, but your limb was never at serious risk." During an attack from German cruisers at sea the previous Easter, Aunt Violet had become injured in a confrontation with a desperate killer at a coastal hotel. "Easy for you to say." Aunt Violet dismissed her with a look and turned back to the inspector. "And since when did you deal with burglaries? Aren't murders your normal purview?" Hannah dragged a chair closer and sat, her hands folded in her lap, as the thought occurred to her too. "We're short-handed right now, what with this conscription law. We've lost 6 men to the army this month alone." As he withdrew a notebook from a deep pocket in his raincoat, the hem caught on the corner of the desk. Issuing a tut of annoyance, he gave it an impatient tug until it broke free. He rolled his shoulders and flicked through the pages. "Yesterday evening," he read from the page, "a man walking his dog in Floral Street near Covent Garden spotted a jeweller's shop that had been broken into." "In Floral Street?" Hannah tensed, anticipating his next words. The inspector nodded. "It was well after closing time, but the proprietor was still there and must have surprised the burglars and was attacked." Hannah released an involuntary groan, bringing the inspector's eyes up from the page to pin her with a concerned frown. "Are you all right, Hannah?" "Sorry." Hannah waved him away. "Please, continue." "If you're sure." He cleared his throat. "The owner, a Mr. Jacob Cornelis, was discovered lifeless on the floor of the shop." "You mean he's dead?" Penny gasped, earning a nudge to the ribs from Archie. Hannah's vision tunnelled, and Aunt Violet's cry of, "Oh, the poor man," seemed to come from far away. An image of the rotund jeweller floated into her head. Wearing his ubiquitous long coat and top hat, he would make himself comfortable in the reading corner and pore over a Dickens novel. Aunt Violet gave him tea on each visit, which he accepted as if being offered a rare prize, and always referred to her as "dear lady" in his rich, slightly accented voice. But why would they kill him? Aunt Violet brought a hand to her throat. He was not much over 5 feet tall, so he would have been easy to overpower. "Probably to prevent him raising the alarm," Archie snorted lightly. "The thieves probably took fright seeing him dead, so filled their pockets quick and legged it." He tilted back his chair, lifting the front legs 2 inches from the floor. Just as Hannah thought it might topple over, he righted it again. "That's the conclusion I came to, Mr. Root." Inspector Farrell grinned. "The market workers in the nearby social club turned out and rallied round. They even temporarily repaired his shop door and took care of his distressed stepdaughter." "She was in the shop when the break-in occurred?" Hannah asked, finally finding her voice. "Not during the burglary, but when the constable went to inform the family, the young lady insisted on seeing Mr. Cornelis for herself. It took 2 policemen to wrest her off his body. Now, I must ask, have any of you heard rumours about Mr. Cornelis among local shopkeepers? Good or bad? He was a Belgian gentleman, I understand." "You think someone burgled his shop because he was Belgian?" Hannah recalled the welcome that had been offered to the refugees as they flooded into the Kent coast. Graphic details of what the Germans had done in their country appeared in the newspapers, described as the rape of Belgium. The invaders targeted the civilian population, shooting them in their thousands, looting and burning towns and inspiring outrage everywhere. "Mr. Cornelis wasn't a refugee," Hannah said. "He came here from Antwerp almost 10 years ago. He missed his home city and was so distressed when it was invaded by the Germans." "I've heard there is some resentment towards the village, but not here in the city." Aunt Violet referred to the area in Twickenham on the bank of the Thames, where a Frenchman named Charles Pellebon had established a munitions factory where hundreds of Belgian refugees earned a living assembling grenades. The fact that they were living in local houses and even running shops and cafes was a sore point among local families whose menfolk were fighting on the front. Which scotches that theory, then." He returned his notebook to his pocket. Hannah was about to recount what she had seen the previous afternoon when a sharp tap on the glass brought their attention to the street. A young man in a brown suit beneath a light-coloured raincoat, like his superiors, stood, his fist raised to repeat his knock on the window. "My colleague." The inspector released a small sigh, pointed at the newcomer, then flicked his hand towards the door in a gesture for him to come inside. "You were supposed to be watching for him, Archie." Aunt Violet spoke in a stage whisper. "Sorry, I got caught up in what the inspector was saying." He left the desk and unlocked the door, allowing the newcomer to precede him into the shop. "I spotted you through the window, sir." He snatched off his hat. "My apologies for taking so long, but most of the shops in Wellington Street weren't open yet, and I had to knock every one of them up to get some answers." "Well, you're here now, even if somewhat worse for wear." He gave the young policeman an up-and-down gaze that hitched on a jagged tear in the hem of his raincoat. "What happened there, then?" "Oh, it's nothing, sir." He slapped ineffectually at the coat. "It happened yesterday evening. I was having a drink in the pre-sol when a fight broke out in the public bar. I ousted a couple of ruffians when this horse and cart came round the corner at a fair lick and almost ran me down. I was lucky to get away with only a torn coat." "You should pay more attention, lad," his superior scoffed. "Wheels on cobbles are hard to miss, and I know for a fact you aren't deaf." "Honestly, sir, it was like an apparition." The young detective used hand gestures as he relished the telling of his story. "One minute the street was empty, and the next this horse was almost on top of me. I shouted at the driver to halt, but the fellow was gone." He twisted at the waist to examine the damage to his coat. "If I see that driver again, I wouldn't mind a quiet word with him either." "If you saw him again, Would you recognise him? The inspector asked, openly sceptical. Probably not, sir. The newcomer's face fell in disappointment. It was dark by then, and he was too quick. Thought not. Aidan clicked his tongue. The young policeman returned his superior's look fearlessly, not at all fazed by this challenge. Classically handsome, with deep-set brown eyes, symmetrical features and a square jaw, he seemed more than aware of his own charms, confirmed by the slow wink directed at Penny, making her cheeks flame. Well, sort yourself out, Vane. We've work to do. Inspector Farrell nodded to Aunt Violet. This is Miss Edwards and her niece, Miss Hannah Merrill. And that chap over there is their assistant, Mr. Archer Root. He scratched a spot on his temple with a pencil stub, then pointed it at the young policeman. My junior colleague, Detective Constable Daniel Vane. Known to all as Vane Danny. I'll leave you to work out why. Aunt Violet beamed at the joke, and Penny giggled behind her hand, but the young policeman seemed unfazed by it. Hannah, meanwhile, remained silent, and tried not to show how uncomfortable she was in the company of a man she had seen before. The very man she had seen arguing with Jacob Cornelis yesterday afternoon, just hours before his death. Chapter 4. What instructions do you have for me, sir? Detective Vane stood with his feet planted, both hands in the pockets of his trousers, making a cape of his long coat as if posing for a photograph. We'll continue to talk to the shopkeepers on this road, Aidan replied. I doubt you'll find any witnesses, but it's worth a try. Oh, and see if they found Mr. Cornelis's shop keys yet. The officer who attended couldn't find them, but they must be somewhere close by. Mr. Cornelis must have used them to get into the shop, as he was the only one there. The landlord at the Opera Tavern will probably offer you an ale, but don't linger too long over it. Pubs don't open until noon these days, sir. D.C. Vane reminded him, unless I disguise myself as a market worker, as they're allowed to buy a drink from 9 in the morning. This joke didn't go down well with the inspector, who narrowed his eyes, but D.C. Vane didn't seem bothered. You could make a start with a florist shop opposite. The owner is about to open the premises, so interview her before she makes an excuse about being too busy. Yes, sir. Vane aimed a mildly resentful scowl over one shoulder as he left, crossing the street without checking for traffic. No wonder he almost got run over, Aidan tutted. Now, where was I? Don't uniformed officers usually make door-to-door inquiries? Aunt Violet said. They round up possible suspect names and then pass them on to you for questioning. Normally, yes, but even I have to muck in occasionally these days. On the surface, this appeared a reasonable response, but something in the inspector's voice told Hannah it wasn't entirely accurate, though her aunt accepted it without comment. When was Mr. Cornelis killed?